The quiet visitor on a gray morning in December. A quiet man stepped out of a black car and pulled his coat tight against the chill. He wore plain glasses, a simple scarf, and shoes that looked too ordinary for someone as important as him. Few people recognized Sundar Pichai that day because he wanted it that way. The driver stayed behind as Sundar walked alone through the gates of an old cemetery on the edge of the city. The ground was damp, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Sundar moved slowly, with a strange heaviness in his steps, as though each one was carrying years of memory. He carried nothing in his hands except a small bouquet of white flowers, wrapped in brown paper. He glanced around quietly, checking if anyone was watching, though it hardly mattered. Nobody usually came here at this hour. What nobody knew, not even his closest colleagues, was that Sundar had been coming here for 20 years. Every December, on the same day, at the same time. He never spoke about it. He never let it show in his busy life of meetings, cameras, and speeches. But here, in this lonely place, he was just a man with a secret dot. As he walked further in, he passed rows of stones. Many were cracked and leaning, with names worn away by rain and time. At one point, a crow flapped down and landed near him, startling him slightly. He smiled faintly, as though remembering something, and kept going. The cemetery keeper, an old man with a thick beard, noticed him from afar and nodded respectfully. He had seen him here before, but never dared to ask anything. Finally, Sundar stopped in front of a small grave hidden behind a line of bushes. The headstone was modest, just a name and 2 dates. He knelt and brushed off the dirt with his hand, his fingers lingering over the carved letters. His eyes softened. He whispered something that no one else could hear and laid down the flowers. Carefully. Just then, a voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Sundar froze. He turned and saw a young journalist holding a camera. She looked nervous but determined. She had been following him since he left his office. She had guessed there was something he didn't want the world to know. I'm sorry to bother you," she said, stepping closer. "But I saw you here last year too, and the year before. Can I ask who's buried here?" For a moment, Sundar said nothing. He stood up slowly and adjusted his scarf. His eyes flicked to the camera, then to the girl's anxious face. "It's someone who taught me everything," he said finally, his voice low. "Everything?" she asked softly. He nodded, but the way he said it sounded like a story too big for a single word. Then he turned away and began walking back toward the gate. But the journalist, emboldened, called after him, "Please, I want to understand. I think others would want to know too. Is it family? A friend? A teacher? Why do you come here every year?" He stopped. The question hung in the air. After a long silence, Sundar said quietly, "You wouldn't believe it even if I told you." The journalist's eyes widened. But Sundar kept walking, leaving her standing there, staring after him as the cold wind blew through the graveyard. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that this grave was connected to a choice Sundar made years ago, a choice that shaped his life and almost destroyed it. And tomorrow, someone else was coming to that grave. Someone who could change everything. Asterisk the name on the stone that night. The journalist could not sleep. Even as the city lights flickered outside her window and the distant hum of traffic faded into the quiet of midnight, her mind stayed fixed on the graveyard, the cold wind, and Sundar Pichai's distant face as he said, "You wouldn't believe it even if I told you." His words echoed again and again, like a riddle she could not solve. She sat at her small desk, staring at her notebook where she had scribbled what little she knew. December, every year, white flowers, a modest grave, someone who taught him everything, and that strange look in his eyes, both grief and gratitude, as though the person buried there still spoke to him in some way. She flipped the page over and over, her pen tapping against it. Something about the way Sundar had lingered at that grave made her chest feel heavy. It was more than duty, more than guilt, more than a memory. It felt as though part of him still lived in that spot. And then she remembered something else. just before he left. She had glimpsed the name on the stone. She hadn't dared to get closer then, but she had written it down quickly on her phone. Now she unlocked the screen and read it again under the glow of her desk lamp up. AARV Meta. 1972 to 1999, just a name and 2 dates. No beloved father or faithful friend. No flowers left behind except Sundar's. No signs anyone else had visited in years. The journalist leaned back and stared at the name. It meant nothing to her. She opened her laptop and began searching. Rav Mehta. Hundreds of results. A businessman in Mumbai. A poet in Delhi. A teacher in Kolkata. But none of them seemed to match. She tried narrowing it to the dates. Someone born in 1972. Died in 1999. But still nothing clear. Hours passed. At one point she got up and made tea just to calm her nerves. But when she sat back down, she saw something strange on one of the old news archives. It was just a line buried in an article about a factory fire in Chennai. Among the dead was a local technician named Arav Mehta, age 27. That was the right year, the right age, but nothing else. She frowned. Why would Sundar Pichai visit the grave of a technician who died in a factory fire? How could this man have taught Sundar everything? The more she thought about it, the less sense it made. But she also felt something deeper now, something painful yet irresistible. She needed to know the truth, not just for her story, but because it seemed to matter, as though knowing it would unlock something about Sundar himself, about what kind of man he really was when the cameras were gone. So the next morning, before the sun even rose, she decided to go back to the cemetery. She wrapped herself in her thick coat and walked through the icy streets. The world was quiet at that hour, and her breath came out in clouds as she reached the gate. The old keeper was there again, sweeping the path with a broom. He looked up at her with mild surprise. "You're back," he said simply. "Yes," she replied. Then after a moment she added, I wanted to ask you about that grave. The one Sundar Pichai visits every year. Arav Mehta. Do you know anything about him?" The old man stopped sweeping. For a long time he just stared at her, and his eyes grew distant, as though he were remembering something. Finally he leaned on his broom and sighed. "Not much," he said quietly. "He's been here longer than me. I started working here in 2003. But I've seen Mr. Pichai come every year, always the same day. Always those same flowers, always silent. He stays longer than anyone else." The journalist felt her pulse quicken. But who was he, Arav? She pressed. The old man shook his head. "I don't know. Nobody comes for him but Mr. Pichai. No family, no friends, nobody. Once I asked him why. He just looked at me. Sad. He saved my life." Then he walked away. Those words, "he saved my life," hit her like a stone. She took a shaky breath and thanked the old man, then slowly walked over to the grave again. She stood there for a long time, staring down at the simple stone. "He saved my life." But how? Suddenly she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Just beneath the grass at the base of the headstone, there was a small metal plaque. She knelt and brushed away the dirt. The words on it were faint, but she could just make them out. To the man who believed when no one else did. A chill ran through her. She read it again, whispering the words under her breath. Who was this man? Why was he so important to Sundar? Why had his story been buried along with him? And then, just as she was about to take a photo of the plaque, a shadow fell over her. She froze. Slowly she turned. Asterisk there, standing at the edge of the path, was another figure. Tall, silent, dressed in black. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she could feel his eyes on her. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching her. The journalist stood up quickly, her heart racing. Do you know him? She asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. For a moment, it seemed like he might walk away. But then he said, in a low, deliberate voice, "You shouldn't be here." And before she could say anything else, He turned and disappeared between the trees, leaving only the sound of crunching leaves and the faint scent of cigarette behind him. She stood frozen in place, clutching her notebook, her breath uneven. Who was that man? How did he know she was there? And why had he said she shouldn't be there? She looked back at the grave, the name on the stone, and the little plaque. Then she realized something that made her blood run cold. There were fresh footprints in the mud. But they weren't Sundar's, and they were leading away. Deeper into the cemetery, the man in the shadows, journalist stood there, her breath, hanging in the frosty air, staring at the footprints that snaked away into the deeper part of the cemetery. They were heavy prints, pressed deep into the damp earth, and they seemed to lead toward the oldest section, where the stones leaned and cracked like tired old men. She looked back once more at Arav Mehta's grave. The name on the stone seemed to watch her, as though daring her to follow. Her pulse thudded hard in her ears, but she felt something stronger than fear now, something closer to need. She needed to know who the man in black was, and why he had said she shouldn't be. Here, asterisk. Without thinking much longer, she adjusted her scarf and stepped forward. Each step sank into the mud with a quiet squelch. Around her, the cemetery grew darker. The tall cypress trees stood close here, blocking much of the early morning light. The air smelled older, heavier. She could almost taste the damp stones and fallen leaves. Now and then the wind would rattle the brittle branches above, and she would startle at the sound, only to find nothing but a bird flitting away or a dry leaf tumbling past Dot after several minutes. She began to feel foolish. The footprints were fading now. The ground here was harder and littered with gravel. She could barely make them out anymore. And yet she kept going, her fingers gripping her notebook like it could shield her from whatever was waiting ahead. Then she saw him Dot at first. She thought it was just a shadow among the trees. But then it moved. He was standing several yards away, half hidden behind a crooked marble angel. The man in black. Tall still, his hands in his coat pockets. Even from here she could feel his eyes on her. There was something about his stillness that unnerved her more than if he had shouted or run toward her. She swallowed hard and took a tentative step closer. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice breaking slightly. He didn't answer. She tried again. Do you know Arav Mehta?" Finally he shifted slightly, and his voice came low and calm. "You're asking the wrong question." She felt her breath hitch. "Then what's the right question?" She whispered. He tilted his head just a little. "Why now?" Those two words sent a shiver through her. She didn't understand. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice louder this time, a little sharper. But the man only shook his head, almost sadly, and stepped back into the shadows. She rushed forward, her boots slipping on the wet ground. "Wait," she cried out. "Tell me. Please, why did Sundar come here? Who was Arav to him? What happened here?" But by the time she rounded the marble angel, he was gone. Not even the sound of footsteps. Just the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the cold air. She stood there for a moment, her hands trembling, her notebook pressed against her chest. The silence felt heavier now, as though the cemetery itself disapproved of her questions. And yet, something inside her would not let go. She couldn't. Not now. Slowly she turned back toward the newer section, where Arav's grave waited. But as she walked, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A second plaque, half buried in the earth, just a few feet away from the first. This one was older, rusted, the letters faint but legible if she squinted. She knelt and brushed the dirt away. December 1999. The boy who chose to stay. The words made her skin crawl. She didn't understand what they meant, but they felt heavy, tragic, almost accusing. She sat back on her heels and stared at the two plaques together. To the man who believed when no one else did, and the boy who chose to stay. What had happened? In December 1999, her phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled it out and saw an email notification from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line simply said, If you really want to know the truth, meet me tonight. 9 p.m. The place where it all began. There was no signature, no explanation. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and she felt a strange mix of fear and determination rising inside her. She typed back 2 words, where exactly, and hit send. But within seconds, another message appeared. You already. No. Look closer at the grave. The message made her stomach twist. She shoved the phone back in her pocket and looked down at the grave again. The stone. The name. The 2 plaques. She reached out and pressed her palm against the cold marble. And then, without knowing why, she leaned down and felt along the edge of the base. There, tucked into a narrow crack, she found a folded scrap of paper. It was yellowed and fragile, but still intact. She unfolded it carefully and read the words, written in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. I was just a technician. He was just a boy. Nobody else cared, but he stayed. He stayed even when it burned. He stayed even when I begged him to run. He saved me, and I couldn't save him. But the journalist's throat tightened. She read the note again and again, the words sinking in like stones into water. A technician. A boy. Stayed. Burned. And then, in that moment, she remembered the article she had skimmed the night before, the factory fire. December 1999, Arav Mehta dead. But if Arav was the technician, and he died, then who was the boy? She stood, up slowly, her knees stiff, and stared at the grave. Her mind was spinning now. Sundar's words at the cemetery echoed louder in her memory. You wouldn't believe it even if I told you. And the old keeper's quiet confession, he saved. My life. A boy who stayed. The man in black's voice returned too. Why now? She didn't notice the figure watching her from across the cemetery until it was too late. When she finally turned, she saw him standing there again, closer this time, his face still hidden in the shadows. He raised one hand slowly, and his palm glinting faintly in the morning light. Was a lighter. He flicked it open, the flame small but bright against the gray. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, if you keep digging, you're going to get burned too. Before she could answer, the flame snapped shut, and he disappeared once more, leaving her alone in the cold silence of the cemetery, clutching the fragile note in her hand as her heart pounded like a warning bell. Asterisk, the place where it all began. The journalist did not leave the cemetery right away. She stood there for a long time, staring at the empty path where the man in black had disappeared. The scrap of paper felt hot in her hand despite the chill around her, as if the words written, it still carried the heat of the fire it spoke of. He stayed even when it burned. He stayed even when I begged him to run. Her mind kept circling those words, unable to let go of them. She tried to imagine what that night must have been like. The smoke, the heat, the chaos, and it made her shiver even though the air was freezing. As she finally walked out of the cemetery, her phone buzzed again. Another message, no greeting, no name. 9 p.m. The factory. She stopped in her tracks. The factory, the place where it all began. She didn't even need to ask which one. She already knew. Her memory flashed back to the article she had skimmed. December 1999. Fire at textile factory in Chennai kills 23, including a young technician named Arav Mehta. Investigators called it one of the deadliest industrial accidents of the decade. Cause unknown. Few survivors. But Sundar had survived. And he came here year after year to visit Arav's grave. The boy who stayed. The man who believed. Pieces of the story were falling into place, but not fast enough. Something was missing. As the day wore on, she tried to work to write down what she knew so far, but her hands kept trembling over the keyboard. She kept seeing the man in black, the flame of his lighter, the quiet menace in his voice. You're going to get burned too. When the clock finally crept close to 9, she found herself standing outside the gates of the abandoned factory. The building loomed like a carcass against the night sky, its windows broken, its walls blackened and cracked. Ivy crept up the sides of the bricks, and the air smelled faintly of ash, even now, all these years later. She stood there for a moment, just staring, her breath fogging the air in front of her. The silence was thick here, heavy with memory and loss, She pushed the gate open, its rusty hinges groaning, and stepped inside. The courtyard was littered with shards of glass and twisted metal. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then quieted. She shone her phone's flashlight ahead, casting a pale circle of light that bobbed with each step she took. Dot inside. The factory was worse. Dark, hollow, gutted by fire. Charred beams leaned against walls, and the smell of old smoke still lingered. Her light swept across blackened machinery, tangled wires, piles of ash. She imagined what it must have looked like when it was alive. Men and women working at long tables, the hum of machines, the smell of cloth and dye. Now it was only a tomb. She didn't see him at first. But as she moved further in, toward the center of the room where the roof had collapsed, she caught the faint glow of a cigarette ahead of her. The ember flared red, then dimmed, then flared. Again, Dot, he was leaning against a column, waiting. The man in black. She stopped a few feet away, her breath catching. You, she began, her voice cracking. Why did you want me to come here? He didn't answer right away. He just took a long drag on the cigarette and exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upward into the darkness. Finally, he dropped it on the ground and crushed it under his heel. Because you keep asking questions you don't understand, he said. She clenched her fists at her sides. Then help me understand. Who was he? Why does Sundar Pichai come to his grave every year? What really happened here? He stared at her for a long moment, his face still half hidden in the shadows. Then he laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound. You think this is just a story, he said. You think it's about grief or respect or gratitude? But it's not. It's about debt, and some debts can't be paid. She felt her chest tighten. What do you mean? He stepped closer now, and she could finally see his eyes. Dark, tired, and filled with something that looked like regret. There was no accident, he said, his voice low and sharp. There was no faulty wiring, no spark from a machine. Somebody set the fire on purpose. The words hung in the air, like smoke. She felt her knees weaken. What are you saying? She whispered. He tilted his head slightly. I'm saying Sundar Pichai wasn't supposed to walk out of here that night. Nobody was, but he did. Because somebody else stayed. She felt the back of her neck prickle. Arav. She murmured. The man nodded. Slowly. He could have left. He had the chance, but he stayed. For Sundar, the man's voice faltered then, just for a moment. He believed that boy could make it out, so he stayed. And burned? She swallowed hard, her throat aching. Why? Why would he do that? The man's eyes narrowed. Because Sundar was just a boy. A shy, skinny boy who used to come here after school and watch the men work. He didn't belong here. But Arav saw something in him, called him little. Professor, taught him how the machines worked, taught him how to fix things, how to keep going when everything's falling apart. Nobody else noticed, but Arav did. Her hands trembled as she clutched her notebook to her chest. She tried to picture it, a boy in a school uniform, standing shyly in the corner of this very room, watching a kind young technician show him how to mend wires and tighten screws. And then she began, her voice barely audible. The man finished it for her, and then the fire. When it started, everyone ran, but Sundar froze. Couldn't move. Arav dragged him to the door, but Sundar wouldn't leave. Kept saying there were still others inside. Arav pushed him out anyway, told him to run, and he stayed. The journalist felt her throat tighten so hard she could barely breathe. But why was the fire set? She asked, her voice shaking. The man's expression hardened, because somebody wanted the land. Wanted the factory gone. Wanted to make it look like an accident. And it worked. Everyone believed it. Because nobody cared enough to ask. The silence that followed was deafening. She felt her heart hammering in her chest, her skin cold and clammy. And you? She asked finally. Who are you? He stared at her for a long moment before answering. Someone who knows what happens to people who ask too many questions, he said. She felt her breath catch again. Why tell me any of this? He turned then, stepping back into the shadows. Because you already started digging, he said. And now you can't stop, but be careful. Some stories burn everyone who touches them. And with that, he vanished. Into the dark, leaving her standing alone in the hollow remains of the factory. Her heart pounding, the smell of ash thick in her throat as she turned to leave. She noticed something scratched into the wall by the doorway. Faint, but still. Visible under the beam of her light. Little professor. Live for both of us. She stared at the words, her chest aching, her eyes stinging, and then she heard it. A faint sound from the far corner of the room. Not footsteps, not the wind, but the quiet, unmistakable crackle of fire. Asterisk the truth under the ashes. At first, the journalist thought her mind was playing tricks on her. The faint crackle she heard seemed too quiet, too small to matter. She froze, holding her breath, and listened again. There it was, soft, irregular, like dry twigs catching flame. She swept her light toward the corner of the factory where the sound came from. Her heart thumped faster when she saw it, a tiny orange ember glowing faintly on the blackened floorboards. Sending up a thread of smoke. She stumbled backward, instinctively, her light shaking wildly across the walls. But as she stood there, staring, the ember didn't grow. It just glowed there quietly, like a warning. She edged closer, her breath sharp in her throat. And then she saw it, not just the ember, but what lay beside it. A matchstick, freshly struck, still smoldering at the tip. And next to it, a folded sheet of paper weighed down by a piece of charred metal. Her fingers shook as she knelt and picked it up. She unfolded the paper slowly, feeling the brittle edges threaten to tear. The handwriting was rushed but legible, scrawled in thick black ink. If you're reading this, you've already learned too much. But you deserve to know everything. I don't know if Sundar will ever tell you himself. Maybe he can't. Maybe it's too heavy. But here it is. She swallowed hard, her eyes scanning every line, her hands trembling as she read. I worked at this factory for 7 years. Nobody noticed me much. Just another technician in a line of many. But one day a boy started showing up. After school. He was quiet, polite, always watching the machines, asking questions. He learned fast. He was different. I called him Little Professor. He laughed at that, but kept coming back. Then one winter night the fire started. I saw the men who lit it. I heard them whisper they were paid to make it look like an accident. I thought I could stop it, but I couldn't. The flames spread faster than I imagined. People screamed and ran, but not him. He froze. I dragged him toward the door, but he refused to leave. He kept shouting about others trapped inside. The roof groaned. The beams fell. I begged him to go, but he stayed. So I stayed too. I pushed him through the door just before it collapsed. He looked back at me with tears in his eyes as the flames closed in around me. And that was the last thing I saw. He lived. I didn't, but that's how it was supposed to be. So if he comes here every year, it's not just to thank me. It's because part of him never left this place. Part of him is still here, in these ashes. If you tell anyone this story, tell them he was worth it. Arav Mehta. The journalist's hands shook so badly now she nearly dropped the paper. Her eyes burned as she blinked back tears. She could picture it all now. The boy with his thin arms and earnest eyes. The young technician pulling him through the smoke. The flames eating the walls. The world collapsing. She pressed the note too. Her chest, unable to move for a long moment. When she finally stood up, she noticed something strange. There was a figure standing outside the broken factory door, silhouetted by the faint moonlight. Tall, still, quiet. Not the man in black this time. That it was Sundar. Her breath caught. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't called out. He was just standing there, watching her, his hands in his coat pockets. His face was hard to read in the shadows, but she could see the weight in his eyes. She took a hesitant step toward him, clutching the note. She began, her voice cracking. You knew I'd come here? He nodded faintly. I was hoping you wouldn't, he said quietly. She stared at him, her throat tightening. Why? She asked. He took a long breath, glancing at the darkened walls around them, because some memories are easier to carry when they stay buried, he murmured. She swallowed hard, stepping closer. You came here tonight too, she said softly. Why? His eyes met hers, then full of grief and something like apology. Because I owe him everything, he said. Because I hear his voice every day. Because no matter how far I go, I still see this place when I close my eyes. She held out the note with both hands. He wrote this, she whispered, for you. He took it gently, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. His eyes moved across the page slowly, and as he read, his lips pressed into a thin line. When he finished, he closed his eyes and held the paper to his chest for a long moment. When he finally opened them again, they glistened with tears he didn't let fall. He called me Little Professor, Sundar said softly, almost to himself. I hated that name, but I miss hearing it more than anything now. The journalist stood in silence, unsure what to say. The weight of the room, the history burned into these walls, seemed to settle around them both. But then, before either of them could speak, a loud crack split the air. Both of them jumped. As a beam somewhere above groaned and shifted, then another crack, louder this time. She spun toward the sound, her light catching a shower of dust raining down from the ceiling, and then she saw him, the man in black. Standing on the upper level, leaning against the railing, a faint smile on his lips. You just don't know when to stop. He called down. Sundar single quotes, S face hardened as he stepped protectively in front of her. What do you want? Sundar demanded. His voice steady now. The man's smile widened faintly. Same thing I wanted then, he said. To finish what I started. Before either of them could react, he flicked his lighter open and dropped it. The flame caught instantly, racing along the old dry floorboards, crawling up the walls. The journalist stumbled back in shock as the heat rose fast and fierce. Smoke curling around her. Sundar grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. Run, he said sharply, his eyes still locked on the man above. But she hesitated just long enough to see the man in black step back into the shadows, vanishing once more, and as the fire roared to life around them, she heard Sundar say under his breath, not again. Asterisk, the last promise as fire spread faster than she thought possible. It licked up the dry walls and snaked across the ceiling, smoke pouring down in heavy black waves. The heat bit at her skin as she stumbled back, her chest tight with panic. Sundar was already pulling her by the arm, his eyes fixed on the door, his jaw set with grim determination. But even as they ran, she could feel it, the weight of the story behind them, the voices of the past echoing through the roaring flames. The sound of screams from long ago seemed to mingle with the crackle of fire now, as though the factor itself was remembering what happened that night. She coughed hard, her eyes watering, her lungs burning with each breath. Sundar didn't let go of her, even as debris began to rain down around them. Asterisk, keep moving, he shouted over the roar, his voice low, but firm. Don't stop. No matter what, don't stop. But just as they reached the halfway point, a beam above groaned and gave way, crashing to the floor in a shower of sparks that blocked their path. The heat surged around them, the air thick with smoke. Sundar stopped, his chest heaving as he scanned the room, his eyes locked on a narrow stairwell to the side, partially collapsed but still passable. This way, he barked, already leading her toward it. She didn't argue. She trusted him now more than she trusted herself. Steps creaked and shifted under their weight, and twice she slipped on the ash-dusted wood. Each time Sundar caught her, his grip steady, his expression unreadable. When they finally reached the landing, they emerged onto a narrow catwalk that led to a broken window near the roof. The glass was cracked, but it was their only chance. As they edged along the catwalk, she glanced down and saw the flames consuming everything below. Through the thick smoke, she thought she saw a shadow, the man in black, standing calmly in the center of the inferno, watching them. His hands were in his pockets, his head tilted slightly, as if this was all nothing more than a quiet spectacle. But then the smoke swallowed him, And he was gone. They reached the window just as another section of the roof collapsed behind them. Sundar pushed the glass with his elbow, shattering it, and helped her climb through. The air outside was sharp and cold compared to the furnace inside, and they collapsed onto the roof, coughing and gasping. For a moment, they just lay there, staring up at the night sky, the stars faint behind a haze of smoke. She turned her head and looked at Sundar. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes red, but his expression was calm now, like a man who had finally faced something he'd been carrying for too long. "You knew this would happen," she said between breaths. Didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the sky. "He warned me," he murmured. "Every year, I felt it getting closer. I thought maybe if I kept coming to his grave, maybe if I left flowers and whispered thanks, it would end. But debts don't just disappear." She swallowed hard, her chest aching. "You don't owe them anything," she said softly. He turned, his head then meeting her eyes with a faint, sad smile. "I owe him everything," he said simply below them. The factory groaned and collapsed further, sending sparks and smoke billowing into the sky. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn itself out until the distant wail of sirens finally grew louder by the time they climbed down and walked out through the back alley. The first fire trucks were already pulling up, their red lights flashing against the dark. Nobody noticed them slip away into the shadows later that night. Back in her apartment, she sat at her desk, the faint smell of smoke still clinging to her hair and clothes. She unfolded the note from Arav again and read it slowly. The words, even heavier now that she had seen the place where it all happened. "He stayed even when it burned. He stayed even when I begged him to run." She traced the letters with her finger, tears pricking at her eyes. And then she noticed something she hadn't. Before, on the back of the note, in smaller handwriting, was a final line. "Little professor, live for both of us. Never stop fixing things." She stared at it for a long time, her chest tight. The next morning she returned to the cemetery. The sun was just rising, casting pale gold light across the stones. She found Sundar already there, standing quietly in front of Arav's grave. This time he wasn't alone. In his hands he held a small metal box. He knelt and placed it gently at the base of the stone, next to the flowers. She stepped closer and asked softly, "What is that?" He glanced up at her, his eyes calm now. "The last piece," he said quietly. "Something he left behind. Something I wasn't ready to return until now." She watched as he opened the box and revealed what was inside. A worn, blackened wrench. The metal was scarred from fire, but still whole. "He carried it everywhere," Sundar murmured. Said it reminded him that even the biggest problems could be fixed, one turn at a time. He set it down a stone, resting his hand on it for a moment before finally standing. Together they stood there, in the silence of the morning, as the wind stirred the grass and the trees whispered above. Before she left, she asked him the question that had been burning in her mind since the beginning. "Why did you keep it a secret all these years? Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" He looked at her then, his expression quiet but steady. "Because it wasn't my story to tell," he said. It was his. And then he turned and walked away, his figure slowly fading down the path, leaving her alone with the grave, the flowers, and the small metal wrench catching the morning light. She stayed there a long time, her notebook clutched in her hands, the faint smell of smoke still lingering in the air. And when she finally closed her notebook and looked up at the grave, she whispered one last thing before leaving. "You stayed. Now we'll remember." And as she walked back through the gates of the cemetery, a faint breeze rustled through the trees. And for just a moment, she thought she heard a quiet voice behind her, warm, kind, and proud. "Little professor." Then it was gone.